Well, I think of somebody lively, full of energy.
A very outgoing, gregarious personality.
The man, I think, was inextricably linked with the music. He was first and foremost a composer. He still found time to be able to compose really the whole of the time.
We musicians can always recognise a Mathias piece.
It made quite a name for himself for writing short choral pieces.
With a lot of Mathias, it's all about the rhythms, all about the rhythms.
The spirit of dance is quite important to a lot of his music.
The interaction between Wales and the outside was really crucial.
He really knew what he was doing. We were slightly in awe of him because of his musical ability and so on.
He wanted to write music that was authentically Mathias. He achieved a level of public recognition that contemporary classical composers don't often get. If you hadn't heard of Mathias before then, you'd certainly heard of Mathias after then.
I think he just was extraordinarily musical. He's one of the most musical people I've ever met in my life.
He had a very friendly sort of manner, seemingly very extrovert kind of personality.
He always seemed to radiate a kind of positive energy in public.
I think to listen to his music is to give you a good idea of the kind of person he was. There's an energy and a vitality.
He made you think, on your toes, and he was always somebody you could relate to.
Well, he was born in Whitland, which is in Carmarthenshire, on the 1st of November 1934. He was the only son of my grandparents, James Hughes Mathias, and my grandmother, Marion.
His mother played the piano. She also played the organ in chapels, and so there was music in the home.
His mother was the accompanist of the Whitland male voice choir.
My grandmother was played regularly in the local Baptist church. She was a very accomplished organist and pianist as well.
His father was a history teacher, the head of history at Whitland Grammar School, and therefore there was an academic side to Mathias's upbringing. He didn't speak Welsh often and regularly. It possibly had got a bit rusty, but he'd spoken it from childhood.
It was sort of what I would call posh Welsh. The more relaxed he was, the more it moved into to Welsh. He was a child prodigy, first of all, I think, as a pianist.
And I suspect that he found it natural just to go to the piano, just like the little Mozart did. If the instrument's there and you see somebody playing it and you hear it, it's a natural inquisitiveness.
The piano was a very important part of his compositional process. He composed as a pianist.
There would be a relatively isolated sense as a child there in the country. You don't have, masses of people running around all the time. He would have been focused very much in his own environment, and so moving on to compose music, that was hardwired, I think.
He attended the Whitland Grammar School. It was his father's school. My grandfather went on to be deputy head of Whitland Grammar School.
Because his father taught all the kids in the school doing history, Mathias, I think, felt a pressure that he was, under a certain focus, because the father was keen for Mathias to do history and other subjects like English. And I think there was a bit of tension when they were doing mock exams, or whatever the term was then, in the history paper. Mathias had sat in the exam room, and all he did was doodle, and he didn't actually write a single word, because it was history and his father was going to mark that paper. It wasn't the real paper, but of course it was just a sign that there was a bit of there was a rebel spirit in there. He wasn't necessarily wanting to have to do everything that was being put in front of him as a path. And I think he always retained a bit of that spirit of rebellion, of sometimes going against the grain.
It was very clear that my father had a very intense interest in music from a very early age. He started playing the piano quite naturally at home from the age of 3. So my grandparents thought, well, we better get him let him have some piano lessons. And it was when he was 6 that he went for piano lessons with David Lloyd Phillips. When he started to write as a child, he would make little, rather than words, whether they'd be Welsh or English, he used to make sort of signs on the paper, and it was only later that he realised, well, actually these are musical stems.
And I think he learnt a lot then about repertoire, being able to play at a very advanced level as a pianist, and then he would be playing in local concerts.
So from about 6, 7, 8, he's appearing on the programme in these concerts as billed as boy pianist William Mathias, and he'd often include one of his own pieces even at that stage.
The interesting thing is that there wasn't a music teacher in the school.
Because in those days, very often there wasn't very good music teaching in school. Certainly the school that I went to, music teaching was, well, not good at all.
He was largely self-taught, I suppose, but I do remember that he used to say how valuable it was to have the radio and to be able to hear the third programme, which was the equivalent of Radio 3, that would come up, and there, he was introduced to a very broad variety of music, and he found that invaluable.
In Whitland, where of course you remember the time, this is the 1930s, 40s, in any case it's wartime, but also they weren't going to concerts anywhere. I mean, visits, say, to go to Swansea, to the Brangwyn Hall, were very, very few and far between, but they would stand out. The fact that he didn't have anybody guiding him, telling him what to do as a young student, meant that he was forced to be independent. I mean, he was composing reams of music all the time at school, in his school days. Some of that, of course, was put to use because he wrote the school song. They show that while he was working on his own and imagining what a composer might do and how he might compose, nevertheless, rather in the way that Benjamin Britten always said that he felt a composer ought to be useful. That's an early example in the case of a school song of Mathias thinking, well, this is something I can do. So probably the words were floating about somewhere, and he just found that, there we are, I can do this, I can write a song, and nobody else would have been able to do that, and it stuck. Fairly recently, I've come across something he wrote when he was about 15. An old friend of mine got in touch and said that his aunt, who lived in Carmarthen, had found this manuscript, and it was a love song. The poetry had been written by a young student in the school who I think was soft on her, and this poem had been written, and that he'd asked Mathias, as the obvious musician, would you write a song to this? And he did, and of course it remained unknown and unseen until this lady, well, she knew about it and told her grandson, look, I've got the Mathias manuscript when he was just... So things like that show you how he was able to apply his gifts very naturally and practically.
I think it's absolutely charming to write a sort of poetic and musical love letter in this form. What an amazing thing to have.
The fact that he wasn't constrained, say, by a curriculum, this terrible idea, you've got to listen to 3 pieces of music in your entire school career, and that's what you know. Well, that he was never, restricted by that kind of mentality. His mind was able to roam and wander, and his world, therefore, was a world existing in the imagination to a large extent.
He was first and foremost a composer.
In a sense, you could say he ate and drank music. It was as natural to him as breathing.
It was interesting because he was head of department, he did a vast amount of teaching, he ran a concert series there, and yet he still found time to be able to compose really the whole of the time.
There are relatively few in any one generation where the combination of drive and talent and the necessity of writing music combined with work that has a certain kind of natural organic integrity, those people are very few and far between. You can always tell that the spirit of that person is there and that it emerges in the music.
He's a very meticulous planner, so he'll plan out ideas fairly fully in his head, and his initial sketches tend to be fairly fully formed. He picks out particular motifs, be they rhythmic or melodic, or often both, and will build upon them to form longer pieces of music.
I think he used to compose at the piano quite a bit, because of course Will was a very, very fine pianist, and also, he would write the music, think of the music, compose it. He would work late into the night. He was a total workaholic. He'd work in the university all day, and he'd be working at his scores until 4 o'clock in the morning.
He would say in various broadcasts or certain talks about the way in which he tried always to find a great clarity. That, in other words, he often talked about creating something out of complexity and then stripping away the layers to find what he really meant at the core of it. There were a few things. He did once say to me, when you start writing something, how do you do it? What do you do first? And I just said, thinking off the top of my head, but it was true. I said, well, I will sit at the piano. I will have thought about what I want somehow to do, thinking of a choral piece or a piece with an organ, say, accompaniment or whatever. And I said, and then usually, having thought about it, I'll put my hands on the piano and find that what I've plonked my hands down on, that's where it is, that's where it starts. And he said, yes, that's the way you do it, that's it.
I always knew when a piece was on the way. So he would become quite preoccupied. It was quite clear that he was thinking through something. My mother and I would say, there's a piece on the way. And so he'd become quite, preoccupied, perhaps even a little bit slightly withdrawn as he was thinking things through. And then once that process was ready, he would come in here into his studio, and he would start writing. He'd sketch a piece out in very loose sketches, and try the occasional things out at the piano, and then commit to putting pen to paper.
There's a well-known Welsh expression, "Da chi di'ch plesio?" Are you pleased? And Will wanted to please. This didn't denigrate his music. And in all the works I know by William Mathias, he was able to communicate to people.
His way of thinking was in fact to clear away in his mind all the complexity, or to find the shape, to find the kernel of what he wanted, the scale of it, to know what the length would be, what the movements would be, and then he would start.
He goes up to Aberystwyth in September 1952. Most people of that part of Wales, if you were talented and bright, it was sort of taken for granted that you would go to Aberystwyth University. His school, Whitland Grammar School, didn't really offer music as an A-level. It was thought, well, perhaps perhaps yours to read subjects that are allied to the A-levels that you did, which was English, French and history.
He wanted to go to university in Aberystwyth, where he imagined perhaps that he would do music. Well, of course, he didn't have an O-level or an A-level and those things, and his father particularly didn't really want him to pursue music as a subject, so he did other things. And it was only when he got there that they realised that he was so naturally gifted, probably far and away more gifted than most of the other students in the department.
He was reading English, French and philosophy. As soon as he got to Aberystwyth, it became very clear. He got involved in music making of the university and musical life, and it became quickly very apparent that here was someone serious about music.
And there was no question in his mind that he wanted to be a composer, whatever he was doing. So having to do history, having to do English, some things. I mean, he used to say that he absorbed all of that. I think in doing philosophy, for instance, he was able to read a lot of Jung. And because he'd begun to be aware of Michael Tippett, a child of our time, the Jungian element of Tippett's writing, he found all of that fascinating and absorbing. In Aberystwyth, he wasn't isolated from musical life, because suddenly there is an orchestra, college orchestra, the choirs, performers, all sorts of things going on musically, which he formally, at this initial point, isn't a part of. You couldn't escape from Aberystwyth and regularly go to London or Bristol or Cardiff or anything. You're there. And he became a star, a bit of a star, as a performer, being able to play, getting to know all the other people who were doing music and making it clear to the authorities, hang on, this boy really needs to do music.
In January of 1953, he wrote Flute Sonatina. That's performed at Aberystwyth in May of 1953. It wins an Inter-College Composition Prize. As you can see, everybody becomes aware that there's this brilliant boy who's writing music. He catches the eye and the ear of Ian Parrott, who was the professor of music at Aberystwyth at the time. And it was quite clear that my father wanted to read music. And Ian Parrott actually even went to visit my grandparents to explain and to support my father in doing this.
I remember him talking a lot about Gronwy Rhys, who was the principal, who was a man with very, very colourful outside interests. And he would bring a sense almost of a whiff of scandal, a whiff of the London world of politics and espionage and all kinds of things into Aberystwyth. And Mathias relished that. So his mind, he was already, his focus was beginning to show a kind of an awareness of a wider world and how these things might interact. But then, of course, when he starts doing music at Aberystwyth, he found, I think, again, the sense of such concentrated activity. He was able to play things, conduct things, write all sorts of things, and engage with real music. He only played the piano, really. He learned the viola while at Aberystwyth. I think what it meant was that a practicality about music. He wasn't, he'd moved from the ivory tower, if you imagine, of his own just imaginative world, suddenly into this world where music was a practical activity. You'd get your hands dirty by involving yourself in writing out the parts, in seeing how people could perform this or couldn't perform that, how music had to be tailored to the resources available if you wanted it to sound good.
Aberystwyth opens out a new world to my father, and he's, really at that time then firmly on the path of following a career in music.
straight away it's Mathias. You've only got to hear the introduction. You know immediately it's William Mathias. He's got this signature tune, or signature way of writing, if you like, of the fourths and the fifths.
The earliest works, and then the works he wrote in Aberystwyth, which he acknowledged as his first pieces, they are all very, very broadly diatonic. They've got a modal swing very often, which was an important part of his own voice, but rhythm is always central.
He uses a tonal language that we all understand, but he uses it in his own way. The people who influence him, I think, were people like Gustav Mahler, Shostakovich, and Benjamin Britten, principally Benjamin Britten. And Benjamin Britten's motto, one of them, to be useful and to the living. In other words, you write music for now.
The way he constructed his music was very much in blocks. I think he was very much influenced by Stravinsky and by Messiaen, but he was also reconciling that with things like classical sonata form and so on. So the two things get combined, and that's how he creates his structures. You get very often this sense of statement and counter-statement, thesis and antithesis, and he tends to avoid doing transitions. There's a spicy quality, I suppose, which comes from modality and a liking for, a preference for the interval of the fourth rather than the interval of the third.
Made quite a name for himself for writing short choral pieces of the kind that could be sung by the best choirs, and writing them in a sort of manner which actually elicited a good response from amateur singers.
There are certainly different approaches, different formal approaches to how he was writing his music, but somehow the personal voice, if you like, is always recognisable.
In a lot of his choral works, especially his faster, more upbeat stuff, he uses consistent syncopations to drive his rhythms forward. With a lot of Mathias, it's all about the rhythms,
The spirit of dance is quite important to a lot of his music. His rhythms are extremely inventive. Yes, they're it's like jazz or inspired in some instances, but they're more than just timed sound patterns. His rhythms have a physicality. You can feel them in his music, and that gives it a freshness and a vitality which is very William Mathias.
And Mathias's own sense of how do you root the music? All of his pieces have a sense that he knows exactly where that sense of root is, and if then he wants to slightly enlarge the horizon by making certain things more elusive, well then of course they always work against that context.
Quite a lot of his music is celebratory in tone. His music and his celebratory music has I would say they're suffused with joy. I think joy is a word that a mode of expression that I would associate with my father's music.
We hear a lot of the certainly some of the disjunct melodic writing that typifies a lot of his solo instrumental works, particularly his works for solo woodwinds. We also hear especially his absolute laser focus on the rhythmic building blocks that make up so much of Mathias's output.
He started writing a piano concerto, his first piano concerto. I think it was his final year at Aberystwyth, and it was one of the pieces on which he was examined for his BMus degree, and he performed it in a viva at Aberystwyth in front of the faculty, and the external examiner was Edmund Rudborough, who was a very famous English composer at the time. But Edmund Rudborough famously remarked, well, what on earth is this brilliant boy doing in Aberystwyth? And so it was thought by the faculty that really he should go on for further studies and that London was the place to go. He won the scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music and then went on to study composition with Lennox Berkeley, who was professor of composition there, and piano also with Peter Caton, professor of piano.
He used to talk an awful lot about time in Aberystwyth and in London. I mean, those years, I think, meant an enormous amount to him because they were colourful years. One of the stories he used to say was that the principal then who interviewed him, Sir Thomas Armstrong, had asked him a few questions, and Mathias, being probably naturally, well, I'm a boy from Wales, and so he must have been asked the question, where are you from? Or where were you born? And Mathias said to Sir Thomas, oh, I was born in a little town which you've probably never ever heard of, Whitland. And Sir Thomas said, the best cup of tea on the Great Western Railway, Whitland railway station.
He was writing new pieces, the divertimento for strings, for example, dates from, it was written while he was at the Academy, improvisations for harp, which he wrote for fellow student David Watkins, and his music began to get more broadcasts, not only in Wales but further afield, and he while he was at the Academy, he became heavily involved in the new music club there. The students formed themselves. His contemporaries were Harrison Birtwistle, Cornelius Cardew.
In a way, Mathias's evolution as a musician goes from complete isolation to widening out and widening still further in London. And of course, in London, he would be able to see opera for the first time. In Aberystwyth was pretty limited, just opera made on the hoof. But going to London, he's able to see things like The Midsummer Marriage by Peter Grimes, all the great works which were, in a sense, current and contemporary at that time, as well as hearing and seeing the whole operatic repertoire. I think that meant a lot. Orchestras in London. He began to write for orchestras, and he began to experience the full range of what was on offer.
Especially in the works from around the time he was living in London, there's more of the neoclassical influence of Lennox Berkeley. Tonality here isn't functional, neither is it atonal. This is not broadly surprising because Mathias's teachers and models, broadly speaking, were writing tonal music.
So Lennox Berkeley was a relatively conservative, conservative teacher, in that his own style was resolutely the kind of thing that Mathias was already, within the boundaries of tonality, a language you could trace back to people like Benjamin Britten, Poulenc in France. In other words, not the Germanic serial tendencies. And Mathias was clear that he didn't relate at all to that expressionist, hothouse, Viennese world. He was fascinated, always fascinated, right to the end, by Freud and all of that. But he found, well, that's not the musical culture that I am from, and that I belonged to, but he wanted to, I think, manipulate the notes of music. And so he wrote a group of pieces, partly, I think, to challenge Berkeley, to show, well, you know, don't take it for granted that I'm just going to be writing your kind of music. I want to let my, you know, almost work out this thing from my system and see where I get to.
Well, my mother was Margaret Yvonne Collins, that was her maiden name, but always preferred to be called Yvonne. A singing student at the Royal Academy at the same time that my father was there. She's from Aberramon, which is Aberdare in Glamorganshire. She had the most wonderful contralto voice.
Oh, Yvonne was a character and a half. She was lively, she had an infectious sense of humour. She was able to cut through personalities and get on with people straight away. Her performing skills had been, they were self-evident even when she'd stopped singing in public. I mean, this slightly operatic, dramatic element was there, and she was a good foil to Mathias in that sense. I mean, he used to say that she used to sing through most of his pieces when he'd written something. A lot of his music has a lyrical flow, a sense of line, which is lyrical in its sort of conception, and she obviously was a great help to him in that sense.
She taught at Bangor. She was a singer, and she was the singing teacher. You usually heard her rather than saw her, because the room where she taught was slightly apart from the main music building, and as you walked towards the building, you could often hear her giving a lesson, and she would sing along, and so you heard this kind of dramatic soprano, this disembodied voice coming from this upstairs room.
They met. They belonged to the same group at the Royal Academy, and they started seeing each other and started going out with each other.
When she was 14 or 15, she won the competition at the Miners' Eisteddfod in Porthcawl, a huge thing, and she was offered a film contract to go to Hollywood, for goodness sake.
She had one of the best ears in the business. She was a singer, and she used to say all the time that it was almost a legend in Royal Academy circles that singers didn't have the best ears, and that so oral classes were divided up into often singers at the bottom, other people, and there was a top class for composers mostly, and she was put straight from the bottom up into the composer class, and she said that it turned out that she had better oral sense than most of the composers.
She was a nicely assertive person, so she was quite charismatic. If her husband had been somebody other than Will, you might have described her as the power behind the throne. There was no need to do that in Will's case, because he was himself sufficiently assertive and charismatic, but she was a colourful personality.
The great support to Will. I mean, she did everything for him. She really looked after him. She was an amazing cook. That's one of the things that I do remember about her. I think anybody who was ever a visitor to their house would remember that.
He was such a great composer, and he had a busy social life, and so she helped him enormously. So she, up to a point, really gave up her singing career to, look after Will.
They got married in my mother's hometown in Aberramon. It was very well attended, and it looked a splendid event. It was obviously a very happy day. He got a job at Bangor University as a lecturer. They lived for a little bit in Llanfyfechan, just down the coast, but then moved to Bryn Eithinog in Bangor, which is Upper Bangor. My mother also did some singing teaching at the normal college.
during that time, he wrote First Symphony, First String Quartet, some of his early choral things, which became widely performed. And so his name as a composer was becoming known outside of Wales in a certain sense. So much of his music, and he was helped. I mean, he did have champions outside of Wales, people like David Wilcox at Oxford University Press, conductors like Charles Groves. I mean, he was moving within a world in which the interaction between Wales and the outside was really crucial.
I started as a student in Bangor University in 1959 doing music, and that's when he came to Bangor. We used to have classes in this small house at College Road. There were just 3 of us in the class, and he used to teach me composition and orchestration. And from the very beginning, I was aware of, if you like, a master craftsman. He really knew what he was doing. We'd go to this little room in 37 College Road, and he just made it very easy. He was a very easy person to get on with. We were slightly in awe of him because of his musical ability and so on, but he put us, at our ease.
Well, I went to Bangor in 1963, and I graduated in 66. There was no need to feel any nervousness at all. He was witty and friendly and, welcoming. I was in a group of 6 BA students. None of the other people in the class, the other girls in the class, none of them were composers at all. So there was there was a special bond, I think, I felt that I had with him, and which continued after I left university.
I think I became a friend, certainly, when I was a student, really, because when I did for the Beamers in Bangor, you had to write an extended composition in your 3rd year, and he was my supervisor. So I got to know him really well. I went to his house very often for lessons and so on.
I remember writing a diatonic piece for him once, and he thought, why don't you sharpen the 4th, and instead of having the scale, let's say the scale of C major, C to C right notes, why don't you just have the scale to C with an F sharp rather than F natural, which gives you that sort of bright, sort of particularly sort of Lydian inflection.
After studying at the Royal Academy of Music, where he studied, I came back to Bangor as a lecturer in, I think, 1966, where he was still a lecturer. So we were colleagues then for a while.
He was starting to receive commissions in the early 60s. He'd been offered a publishing contract with Oxford University Press, and he was a house composer, which means that pretty much everything that he wrote was published by peers. So that seems quite an unusual arrangement these days, but it was, it was a real support to the Dance Overture, commissioned for the National Eisteddfod in 1962. So you have some very big commissions coming in, and he's doing that alongside his lecturing job at Bangor University. 99%
of his works, as far as I know, were written to commission. He was also a public figure. He served on very important bodies, the Arts Council of Wales. He was the governor of the BBC in Wales. I think he was president of the Incorporators. He did lots and lots of things outside. He was an incredibly hard worker, and every work he wrote really worked for whatever the genre was. There was a buzz around him, really, which really, I think, really started or gathered momentum when he was in London. He was receiving broadcasts of pieces then in the late 1950s. People started to notice his name. He has a publishing contract. So it all starts to sort of, gather momentum for him. And suddenly everybody's talking about William Mathias. My father was offered a job at the Edinburgh University, and so they moved lock, stock and barrel. When they travelled to Edinburgh, Yvonne was heavily pregnant with Rhiannon, with the child. So I travelled up by train with Yvonne, well, went by car. They had a very nice house on the west side of Edinburgh. Edinburgh is a very famous musical university. I don't think he was entirely happy there, to be honest, because rather than teaching composition and orchestration, I had to do more of the academic side of work.
I was born in Edinburgh. I suppose I've got a little bit of Scottish air in me.
And I remember him saying that he was writing his third piano concerto at the time, and they were in some doubt as to which was going to emerge first, whether Rhiannon would be born or whether he would finish the concerto.
But unfortunately, his father, my grandfather, became very ill and passed away, and so my father decided to finish his job in Edinburgh and to move back to Whitland.
They went back to Whitland, ostensibly, to run the drapery business, which was a family concern as well as other things. And he was glad to get back to Wales.
He'd been commissioned by Llandaff Festival to write a concerto for Ossian Ellis, the famous Welsh harpist. And so he started to write his harp concerto in Whitland. And the first movement he's on record as saying is very much inspired by the land and seascapes of southwest Wales where it was written.
The professor of music in Bangor was Reginald Brindle, and I found out just before Christmas '69, I suppose, that Reg Brindle had been appointed professor in the University of Surrey. And I shouldn't have found out, I found out via the secretary. So on Boxing Day, 1969, I drove down all the way from Kemys Bay, where I lived, to Whitland. I drove very fast with nothing on the road, to tell Will in advance that the proposed professor of music would be happening, you know. So he applied for the job, and of course he got it. And I remember we had a few drinks and played Scrabble and made all sorts of very, very rude words up, and were hysterical. I remember many happy times with Will and Yvonne.
My parents moved back to the area. Bought this house. So this was a new and important aspect to his career. So and it's interesting because his name, although he's he was born in Whitland, South Wales, his name is very much associated with North Wales.
When he came to Bangor as professor, his name attracted a lot of students. For instance, John Pickard, he would only have come to Bangor because William Mathias was there, and lots of people did that. And the biggest thing he did, probably as professor of music, was teaching music. It's a bit shambolic in my time, little rooms in terrace houses. Will managed to build up a purpose-built music department in the old Bangor Museum, which had been the Bangor Girls' Grammar School. Now this was situated right by the two concert halls, the PJ Hall, the big concert hall, and the Powys Hall, the small concert hall. And somehow or other he managed to purchase that, get that for the music department, and a very fine music department was created with lecturers' rooms, teaching rooms. Will had an enormous room to himself, and a superb music library, enormous numbers of records, listening booths. So really, that was a very important part of the whole thing.
By the time I came on the scene, he was already well established. By 1970, the mid-1970s, his profile is such that he's already very, as I say, established. So there's an orchestral work called Laudy that he wrote in 1973, and by the mid-70s, it's one of the most, it is the most often performed piece of contemporary music by a living British composer.
He had an organ built for the PJ Hall. So when you look in the PJ Hall, the magnificent organ is on the stage.
I think the Welsh spirit, the Welsh landscape, but also the Welsh personality was something he really related to. And I think that he felt himself almost out of water when he was not in Wales. And yet he was somebody who never felt a kind of, a sort of narrow-minded sense of wanting to be one particular kind of person. I mean, he had broad horizons. But I think Welsh, the ambience of Wales was crucial to his creativity, so that his first spurt of maturity as a composer developed quite naturally while he was in Bangor.
Historically, we're a nation of singers, choirs, solo singers. And much of Mathias's greatest music was for the human voice.
He speaks certainly about considering himself to be Celtic and how his Celtic identity influences the pluralism of genre in his own compositional writing.
His own mindset was one that took a view of music which in some ways was radically different to the kind of almost evolutionary process that you were taught very often in academic terms, that there was a constant development of language from this stage to that stage to this stage, and it was implied that this was always a progression forward. And he used to say, you need to understand what the language and the way in which composers organise music were at its highest level at any particular time. His job was to write music which resonated with people, and that meant that if they responded to the kind of sense in his music, he was happy. And I know that he was happy, as it were, with a number of his pieces which he felt had connected with an audience. And I think that's what meant most to him.
There are very few others in the Welsh scene at that point that have the same kind of impact on the way that Wales is perceived from the outside. I think even to this day, if you asked somebody to name a recent Welsh composer, the first name that would come to most people's minds is William Mathias.
I mean, he loved the medieval Welsh elegies, the epics, the poetry that you find in Wales. The nature of the Welsh language is important as well. He'd often talk about the extraordinary contrasts that you find in Welsh poetry. For example, sort of wonderful, dazzling jewel colours contrasted with sort of dark, elegiac kind of, those tragic qualities.
There was not all that much serious modern classical music in Wales that would have been of interest to him, apart from the work of about 3 or 4 composers like, for instance, Daniel Jones, Grace Williams, David Wynne, an almost contemporary Alan Hodinott in Cardiff. There was no great sort of body of history of Welsh music that was of particular interest to him, but I suppose he actually felt himself very much a part of the British tradition.
He wanted to write music that was authentically Mathias, rather than music that was Welsh.
The way in which you define that character is very, very difficult. You end up needing to look at metaphors and comparisons. He himself did. He talked about the qualities or the characteristics of Celtic art in terms of colour, jewelled colours he wrote about, vivid rhythms. I mean, he in a sense is describing his own musical language in these terms and relating them to what he perceived to be particular qualities of Celtic music as opposed to, let us say, Anglican music. The world of the church in Wales, musically, that he found himself moving into, was virtually non-existent in musical terms, and yet so he works there within a world where he's immediately on a path up towards Cambridge, towards Oxford, where church music was absolutely vibrant, and he finds his own way of navigating that journey, and he finds his own way, so that you could almost say that there are patterns of Welshness, patterns of perhaps this sense that the Welsh have of communication, the gift of the gab. His music is often based on speech, on vibrant communication rather than on obfuscation.
He was one of the most popular writers of Anglican church music, with countless anthems, settings of the canticle and so on. And there's one very interesting one, a setting of the communion service in Welsh, a parish communion for the people to take part.
He achieved a level of public recognition that contemporary classical composers don't often get. Therefore, Mathias being authentically Mathias creates to the outside world this idea that this is Welsh music.
At that time, which was in the early 70s, there weren't really any music festivals in the area. You had earlier the famous Llandaff Music Festival, but there wasn't really an equivalent at the time in North Wales. And so when the North Wales Arts Association asked him to direct a festival, to organise something, he leapt at the chance.
It was something that was needed. It created a real focus for musical activity in that area. It was well located because the catchment area was not just North Wales, but Chester and even Liverpool.
There was a great element of support from arts councils, and they were devolved around arts associations. Fishguard Festival was set up in 1969, 1970, when he was actually living back just for about 18 months. And he felt a reconnection. I know he talked about this as one of the happiest times of his life, musically and personally. A reconnection with the Welsh landscape, the Welsh culture, the Welsh identity, and finding a festival starting, which he was able to help towards. I think moving then to Bangor meant that no festival of any calibre existed in North Wales, and he was the natural person to turn to by the Arts Council and say, well, look, find a place. He chose St Asaph Cathedral because of its acoustic at one end in particular, which was the West End, where he would insisted that the stage was built, as happened in Llandaff Cathedral for the Llandaff Festival, which he was very familiar with.
When they managed to persuade Will to be artistic director, it gave the festival a tremendous fillip and put it on a sort of international basis, really. And it was a huge success. I know we commissioned a piece by Grace Williams, the great Welsh composer. It made it from maybe quite a parochial thing to one of the leading festivals in Great Britain, in fact.
He brought in orchestras and performers, and to some extent included his own music.
William set it up in 1972, William Mathias, and was director for nearly 20 years. And so I studied with him when I was a child. So I know some of the thoughts that were behind his mind, or in his mind, when he was setting it up. So it's daunting because I want to try and keep to that vision that he had all those years ago, 53 years ago.
There would be the main concerts in the evenings, which on the whole would be traditional repertoire. But then you would have the morning, I think, concerts, where perhaps by solo singers or instrumentalists.
And there was always new music. It was always a part of the festival. I myself benefited from that because the first commission that I ever had, the first paid commission I had, was from that festival when I was 20 years old.
And I think the point about the North Wales Festival for him was filling a gap, filling a void. There was no regular opportunity in the area to hear the first class musicians of the day in orchestral terms, in instrumental terms and so on. So that's his vision then, was to bring the best music to an area normally deprived.
He wanted to set up a festival that brings the world's greatest artists to North Wales, instead of us having to trek to Chester or Liverpool or London. And I think that was his idea, that, you know, there's a lot of interest in, we have sold out audiences for our concerts, and so there's a lot of interest from local people, and I think he felt that, and so he brought, you know, the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, the Royal Philharmonic, the BBC National Orchestra Wales. He brought top-class orchestras, top-class soloists to St Asaph.
People would come have a week's holiday in St Asaph, to go to the festival.
It was always a jam-packed week, and I can say that, you know, as a family, there were certain things that were fixed in the calendar, and St Asaph Festival was one of them every September. So I was attending those festivals as a really small child.
The festival started 1972. I first went to it in 1980. In the autumn of that year, I heard Janet Baker singing, which again gives you an example of the kind of artist he was bringing. She'd not sung properly in North Wales ever, and the place was packed. And it gave you a perspective of the finest music in a wonderful setting, the best sound you could think of. And he always spoke to everybody, he always treated everybody as equals. He found a network, and that's what I initially felt I had to do. As times became more difficult, money becoming a problem, you couldn't, as he had done, have 3 big orchestral concerts every year because they would bankrupt anybody. So you had to find a range of music. But my vision personally, and I think it lasted, maybe it wouldn't have lasted much beyond the time when I finished, was to try and look at this venue and bring to it a quality of music similar to the thing you'd get in London, say at Wigmore Hall, the best chamber music, always involving composers, commissioning new works from composers of all ages, within Wales and outside Wales, so that there was a Welsh focus to it, which was something which rooted it again, but it needed to have a wide scope.
Children who come here 50 years ago are now here performing as professionals. And it was the inspiration of seeing the BBC National Orchestra Wales, or seeing Kiri Takanawa or Joan Sutherland, all these people that have been here, and inspiring them. So a lot of people that are involved in the festival now came here as children.
It was a very happy household. I'm an only child, and we're all of us, my father, mother and myself, we're all lively personalities. And it was a very happy childhood, and my father was a very warm person, a very loving person. So there was never any of the, William Mathias, famous composer. I never saw that. It was, family was very important to us, and we worked as a team. And so yes, it was a different, I suppose, different sort of lifetime, because there were certain things in the Mathias, social calendar. We didn't have regular holidays because Dad was too busy. And anyway, it was a distraction from what he had to do. He was a very, very hard worker, had an incredible work ethic. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to do all these things, obviously. That was that was family life, really. So it was different. But it was really exciting. It was really, and it was very sort of natural to be part of all this. And my parents were excellent because I was sort of always involved, and they were very caring parents.
I remember my first meeting with Will extremely well. I was looking to go to university, and I knew I wanted to be a composer, and I'd already written quite a bit of music, and I'd heard Will's music on the radio, liked it very much, and then discovered that he was on the staff at Bangor, and my music teacher at school suggested that I go and see him. So I thought, you don't go and visit composers, you don't just phone up and arrange a visit. It'd be far too busy and too important to see me. But I think the school must have arranged the visit for me, and so off I went on the train from my home in Burnley in East Lancashire. And I remember it was an incredibly wet day. I arrived at the station and it was absolutely pelting down with rain. And I walked from the station to the music department, which was about a mile. And when I arrived there, I was like a drowned rat. And suddenly, there was William Mathias, and I was in his office, and I remember taking off my coat, which was just soaking wet, and we put it near the radiator and sat down to talk. And my coat began to steam. The amount of water on this thing was steaming up the windows, and I felt very embarrassed about that. We started talking, and I expected that the conversation would be maybe 15 minutes. In fact, we talked all afternoon. It must have been for 3 hours. I don't remember what it was that we really talked about. I don't remember the details. What I do remember is that for those 3 hours, he didn't treat me as a schoolboy. He didn't treat me as somebody who wanted to be a composer. He spoke to me as a fellow composer. And nobody had ever done that before.
I first met Mathias at an interview to take a job in his department at Bangor. I was 22. And I went to this room of his in the university. I had about an hour and a half just talking with him. What I remember mostly was he was often invisible behind his desk, clouds of cigar smoke. He smoked cigars readily. And there were stories, some of the stories about his lecturing, for instance, before becoming professor. He smoked cigarettes, and he'd often sit on a desk talking about a particular piece of music to a class with a cigarette in hand, and they used to watch how far the cigarette ash would spread, because he would get carried away in the actual sheer energy, exuberance, enthusiasm of talking.
The act of sort of lighting the cigar was at least as important as actually smoking it. So he was constantly in this struggle to keep the cigar alight. It would go out sometimes without him actually having taken a drag on it, because he was talking all the time. I mean, he was a real talker. You know, once he started, off he went.
He immediately put me at my ease, and I then didn't feel that I was undergoing an interview. He would ask me questions about all sorts of things. I could talk about anything, and he would immediately take. It was like a sort of an ebb and flow, a give and take of a conversation, asking me all the sorts of things I liked about music, what I disliked about music, what I'd learned from my own teaching. And so I found it a very stimulating, completely informal, and something which changed my life.
He'd just written Lux Aeterna, which was the big oratorio for the Three Choirs Festival. And then he wrote his second symphony. I attended the premiere in Liverpool. I had a score of that work, and he signed it for me, wrote a message, and the message read to John Pickard, with grateful thanks for his support at the premiere of this symphony, and look forward to hearing many of his. Now I've written 6 symphonies. When he wrote that, I hadn't written any. So he was prophetic in that way. I think he obviously felt that I was somebody who was going to write symphonies. So maybe he knew something I didn't.
Now a new anthem by Professor William Mathias. Word from Psalm 67. Let the people praise thee, O God, yea, let all the people praise thee.
were told that there was going to be an anthem written by a Welsh composer, the Prince of Wales, obviously getting married, so he chose William Mathias. It was just a handwritten manuscript. These were the copies we had to use because it wasn't published till after the wedding. And the piece turned up, I think, in early June, and I started rehearsing it. And then we got into correspondence with each other about it. You know, he had his views about how it should go, and told me them in a letter. As the Prince of Wales, he chose a Welsh composer to write this piece. And it was a very clever composition. It was one of the psalms from the Book of Common Prayer for the solemnisation of matrimony. It was the one that's appointed, Psalm 67, which opens, God be merciful unto us and bless us.
Charles would have wanted specifically a Welsh composer to write music for his wedding, because at the time he was the Prince of Wales. He wanted that to mean something beyond just using the name of Wales to create a title for the heir to the English throne.
He came to the choir school for a couple of rehearsals, about, I think, 3 or 4 days before the wedding. And I remember one of them very well because we started the anthem and he was sitting just a few yards away from the choir and he yelled out, "Stop!" So we stopped and he said, "Faster, faster." And I said, "You're sure?" "Yes, faster." So we took it faster. The next day we got in the cathedral and we did it at his speed and he was sitting in the dome at St Paul's and his voice said, "Slower, slower." It was a piece that was to catch on. I mean, it was to catch on around the world. It was actually published on that day in a bright red copy. It's a genius composition. You know, it's got joy, it's got beauty, it's got quiet passages in it. It's a one-off piece.
Let the People Praise Thee is both great fun to sing and a great pleasure to listen to. As with most, if not all, of Mathias's published compositions, is well structured, well planned. It just has a good flow to it.
When it was announced that he would be writing an anthem, there were lots of journalists who came to interview him. There was quite a lot of press and publicity. So the buzz of the actual event itself was incredible.
There had not been many royal events, but they happen so often now. But at that time, 1981, there'd been a dearth, if you like, of this kind of grand ceremonial occasion. It sort of really, I can remember back to 1981. I mean, it triggered a huge surge of interest in the country. And I think in the church sense, people knew that Mathias had a proper and a very special track record of writing for the church. And he was able to somehow focus on this in a way of writing something which captured all the characteristics of his own language, but almost turned it into something which spread further than that. It had a sense of the joy, the sense of the luminous quality. And I think the fact that his name was associated with this and that he was Welsh, it meant that this music lived.
course, you don't sleep the night before very well. The day before, Vidal Sassoon, the hairdresser, has sent representatives to St Paul's to do our hair for us, so that we actually looked the part, you know. And of course, you can't lie down if you have to sleep like this, so you don't ruin your hairdo. And the noise of the crowds out on Ludgate Hill, who were camped out that night, of course, kept us awake. I don't think the boys or I got any sleep at all.
O eternal God, creator and preserver of all mankind, giver of all spiritual grace.
I used to stand in the middle between the choir stalls at St Paul's to conduct the choir, but on royal occasions you were told you couldn't stand there. You had to move to one side so that the royal party could see the altar. I was told also, of course, you never conduct with your back to the Queen or the King, but of course you have to if you're conducting a choir, and they're down there. And I got rather excited in one of the big moments in the anthem, and my left hand knocked off a lampshade, which then spiralled up and was caught by a clergyman behind. And evidently it was noticed by the royal couple, who had a good giggle.
Well, one of the things that Will could do that very few contemporary composers can do is he could write a tune. He forged such a strong musical identity in those choral works that he was able to do that. So that was a real gift.
Let the People Praise Thee, O God is a crowd pleaser, really. It's fairly accessible to most decent church and cathedral choirs. It's got a sort of grooviness to it. Most surprisingly, it was at a royal wedding. It was broadcast to millions of people. If you hadn't heard of Mathias before then, you'd certainly heard of Mathias after then.
When he wrote his anthem for the royal wedding, he wrote a piece that could simply be performed by almost any choir. He just wrote something that was very unassuming and very unpretentious, was totally him. And I can imagine many composers would have been paralysed by such a commission. And instead, he just wrote a piece for two people who were getting married.
I'm in a narrow musical slit, if you like, with organ music and choral music. And we certainly knew who he was, but the wider public had never heard the name of William Mathias until that day. And then, of course, you mention William Mathias around to anybody who's vaguely interested in music, and they say, oh yes, didn't he write the royal wedding anthem?
Bangor is certainly the sort of community that broadly likes to support local composers, local musicians. As someone who's writing a lot of music for the Anglican choral tradition with a cathedral on the doorstep, he's got a captive audience. By not being another London composer, by being someone who was a Bangor composer in a sense, that's becomes part of his brand almost.
He wrote to me after the wedding, with a very nice letter about how well it had been sung. And of course it was to make his name, wasn't it? Because isn't it, or wasn't it, the musical premiere with the world's biggest audience? I think over 800 million people. But we didn't think about that at the time. We just did it.
I think it was the university was in dire financial straits, and each department was required to make quite severe financial cuts. And Will decided that if he retired early, that would save quite a lot of money. But then me going in his place as head of department wouldn't cost any more because I was on the staff.
He loved the interaction with his students. He thought it was very important that they be given the highest level of music higher education, if you like, at that stage. He was very professional in the way that he approached his own work as a composer. One of the key things is to nurture new talent. Who are the composers of the future?
I think often of Parry in England and Stanford in England as two composers who were enormously gifted, but they felt themselves almost burdened with the responsibility to take on the role of teaching. And I think in Wales, the same thing to an extent happened to Alun Hodinot and to William Mathias. They were both the two most gifted composers of their generation, and yet because it was an age when our things were being expanded, musical education was developing, they felt, and their careers followed remarkably similar patterns in a way, they took on the responsibility of being professor of music, head of department. This was quite a big job, as it were, because they were figureheads.
My personal experience is that writing music during term is almost impossible. But he did it, and it's perfectly true that he would spend the day in the department doing what he did. He would often come to a concert in the evening. Very often the people, the artists taking part in the concert would stay with him. He'd be up half the night entertaining them after doing the concert, and then the next morning he would turn up to give a 9 o'clock lecture. In the later years, when I was no longer a student, I was no longer an undergraduate student, I lived very close to Will. I lived just outside Menai Bridge, and I used to cycle in and out. And sometimes I would go to London and I would get the train, and even though it's a terribly long way, it was possible to do it there and back in a day. And I would often come back from a concert in London at sort of 2:30 in the morning, and then cycle from Bangor station to where I lived, and I would go past Will's house. And so you'd be talking 3 o'clock in the morning, and the lights in his studio were on. I don't think that did him any good, really. You can't burn the candle at both ends. Sooner or later it will catch up with you. And I fear that didn't do him any good health-wise.
He wanted to retire because he wanted to focus more on composition. And I think commitments, again, you'd have these commissions that were coming in, and so it seemed the right time for him to be able to focus now on composition full-time. He had more time. I saw that there was a sort of increase in pieces because he was able to write more.
Once he'd retired, I saw quite a lot of him, and particularly in the later years. By then, I was doing quite a lot of teaching in Bangor, and I think he liked to chat with me and find out what was going on in the department, because of course for years it had been his department. But also we would talk a lot about music, and I remember particularly the Third Symphony, the last symphony, which personally I think is his greatest achievement. I saw that piece emerging as he composed it. He played various bits on the piano to me as he was writing it.
I left Bangor at the same time as his retirement, but in the life that I subsequently led at a record company in Monmouthshire called Nimbus Records, we started a recording contract. So I kept my link with him. I'd go to the festival every year to see him and the family. I was often back in Bangor. Once I could drive a car, which I was notoriously unable to do. In fact, Mrs. Mathias tried to teach me to drive, but we didn't get that far. But once I could, I would go up there maybe initially, perhaps once a month, And then when he was not well, I would go once every other week. So I retained the contact with him. We almost became closer afterwards because we did so much. And the one thing that had happened during the time that I was there with him was that he suddenly, one evening, something I hadn't expected, and he said, "Oh, come up, and I want to play you something." And he took me to his studio, and he was working on his Symphony Number 2. He suddenly talked about the whole piece, the nature of the piece, the background to it, the shape of it, and he played it all through to me. Before, this was in sketch, and I'd never seen anything. And then something about that moment remained with me, and I think we understood each other to the extent that he'd say to me that, that he needed something he'd needed and never had for a long time was a sort of a sounding board, somebody he could relate to, talk to in complete confidence, that I wouldn't betray that confidence.
But it was also the year that he suffered from illness and had to have an operation, and he recovered from it, but became apparent a little bit later that the cancer had come back.
He was very ill, and I think at that point he knew that he didn't have much longer to live. And I think there was even more of a sense of not wanting to waste a second. The feeling that what he was going to write during that period really had to be the very best he could possibly do. And I think that with the Third Symphony in particular, that's what happened. I really believe that piece is a major statement.
He used to say that he used as much of his energy and resources as he could to compose, but that he had plenty of excess energy that he spent on doing all the other things that he packed into his life. There would be naturally a limit to how much time he could spend on the composition, and so the other things he did, running committees, running a festival, running a music department. He was on a BBC committee, he was chairman of the Arts Council's music committee, he did all kinds of things. He was always on the go, and I think in some ways he wore himself out. There's a story about Mozart, and when Mozart died, aged 35, and tragically early, and yet somebody has related the story that when they opened him up for a post-mortem, they found that his actual organs were those of an old man, and that Mozart's metabolism, his metabolic rate, must have operated at such a level, I mean, this hyperactive thing, that he'd used his physical resources. And I think that was possibly true of Mathias, that he was so needing to spend the energy that he had, that he'd exhausted certain natural resources he had. And so when he was really only in his mid-50s, discovering that there was cancer, I think that was something which he took with a certain remarkable stoicism. I would go every other week, and you do all kinds of things, but one of the things he wanted to do in these last was to kind of go through the work that he'd written, get to the point where he couldn't compose any more, which he did, and he explained exactly how he couldn't write any more, but what his last music would have been, but also to clear through the catalogue of his decades of work and to winnow out certain things, revise others, so that the whole picture was clear. And we did that.
He was remarkable. He was very positive, held the belief that, one must carry on and embrace this. I mean, he once said, if I can't compose, then I wouldn't want to live, because it was just the natural expression, it's what that he did, and he was composing right up till a few days before he died. He passed away on the 29th of July 1992.
I was speaking to him on the radio when he actually, on the phone more or less, when he did die. Well, I knew he'd gone, and there was a doctor there, his wife was there, and I heard him. He'd been thinking about music even that morning. We'd spoken earlier in the morning. He was writing in his own mind a new symphony, but what he'd said was the energy, physical energy to compose had gone. The mental energy was still strong, but you needed the two to make music happen.
The news was soon on the national radio. In fact, I found myself in my garden talking to the BBC Wales about it.
We'd been out of touch for a few weeks, and I suddenly thought that I should phone him. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt the need to phone him and see how he was getting on. So I called. The phone was answered immediately, and it was Yvonne, and I could tell immediately from her voice that something was not right. And I said, "Is Will there?" And she said, "John, he's just died." As you can imagine, it was a terrible shock, and it felt very strange.
It was, to a certain extent, expected. I think his doctors had told him at the end of the previous year that after following the examination that his illness was fatal, really, in the long term. I was by that time living in London, so I wasn't based here. I would come home every weekend to see Dad, and so I saw him on that weekend, just a few days before he passed away.
The last but one work that he wrote was a setting of Gweddi'r Arglwydd, the Lord's Prayer, in Welsh, for the Whitland Male Voice Choir. Now, when he was a boy, Whitland Male Voice Choir, the accompanist was his mother. So there was a wonderful, at the end is my beginning, you know, coming together. And this Gweddi'r Arglwydd is a most deeply felt work. It begins very softly in I think C major for male voice choir, and it goes to high B flat, the highest note male voice choirs sing. And then there's a lovely quiet ending. Oxford University Press published it in English then for mixed choir. But I think it's quite remarkable that literally within weeks of him dying, and knowing he was dying, he wrote this setting of Gweddi'r Arglwydd for the male voice choir, for which his mother had been the accompanist.
There was the funeral itself, which was just at the crematorium in Bangor, and I was present for that, and actually Yvonne and Rhiannon asked me to sort out the music for that, which was, apart from the hymns, the music that was played was entirely Mozart. And then there was a memorial service in St Asaph Cathedral.
He had stipulated that there would be no music by Mathias. It all had to be by Bach and Mozart.
It was held on August the 15th. We had special permission from the cathedral authorities because he wanted to be buried there because, as he said, he wanted to hear the music during festival week. And he does that every year. My mother and I felt it was appropriate that we have an event in London, and so another memorial service was held on the 20th of November of that year in St Paul's Cathedral.
He obviously wouldn't have known of any other event, and so the family and I decided St Paul's Cathedral was the right place. And I went, and most of the music in that was by Mathias because we felt that was right. And John Scott, who ran the music, asked me to write a piece in memory of Mathias for the event. And that was a completely different, that was more like a service of thanksgiving to remember Mathias, which the whole musical world could come to. And it was at a distance. It was in November, the month of his birth. And it was a very joyful occasion.
This event was on a rather different scale, and it was very well attended by his friends and colleagues in the music world in London, and there were representatives from the royal family there, and so it was different, as I say, a very dignified event. His music was included, 3 pieces including the Royal Wedding Anthem, the St Paul's Anthem, as I like to call it, and his Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis as well. It still came as the most enormous shock, I think, to people. I mean, partly because, he was only 57 when he died, so that he could have had many more years. That's really young these days.
I think he almost felt, and I certainly did in a way, that he had reached a point. I mean, he never fought the sense of destiny. He accepted with grace, if you like, the fact that his time was now coming to an end.
In many respects, Mathias was a sort of giant of sort of Welsh composition. So his death would have left a certain space to be filled. It drew the attention of a modern audience of classical music listeners. So after his death, all eyes were still on Wales. Who would be the next William Mathias?
I think very rapidly the number of performances began to diminish. What had once been a kind of a fixture in British music soon ceased to be.
It was felt as a great loss to Wales and Welsh culture by so many people. But of course, he lives on through his music. That's his legacy. His music continues to be performed all over the world, really, today. My mother had done a wonderful job of making sure that my father had everything he needed in order to get on with his music and to get on with his career. So it was a big jolt for my mother. However, she started teaching at the then, I suppose, quite newly established Ganolfan Gerdd William Mathias. It's a music centre that was established or set up, first opened its doors in 1999, and the then directors of the Ganolfan Gerdd, I remember coming to my mother and I to say, we've got this idea for a new music centre, we want to encourage, tuition for students, for pupils, and to do all sorts of things in a musical way. And we'd like to name it after, William Mathias. My mother started teaching singing at the Ganolfan, which was very, very good. And of course, she would receive invitations to attend performances of his work. So the music world looked after her, I suppose, in that aspect. She became, important to the local community as a teacher, as a patron, as a leader, if you like, in her own right after his days, and in fact was recognised, was awarded an MBE for her services to music, which was rather lovely.
In a sense, I found a kindred spirit. I'd related to him, I wanted to support him, and he did many things for me, which over and beyond the call of duty, and I learned so much from seeing him, working with him, And he was a unique figure. I mean, one of those people you felt that he changed the character of time, and he changed the nature of any interaction you had with him, because he was simply so warm-hearted and engaging, but you could focus entirely on the things you wanted to.
Through his encouragement and enthusiasm, he got me to go to the academy. He made me realise what it was to be a musician, and helped me with everything.
He instilled this insistence on clarity, that everything you do has to be done as clearly and as precisely as possible, even when what you're doing is actually complex. You owe it to your performers and to your listeners to be as clear as you can in what you're doing.
It was clear when I was younger that I was, also had musical gifts. So I learnt to play the flute at a very early age, but I also liked writing as well, and went on to become sort of published author, books about music, that is, as well. But he was always so encouraging. Both parents were. There was and supportive, if you like, of those aims. But I admire the way that he managed his career. I admire his work ethic, and so yes, he'll always be a major inspiration, and his music, I suppose, in some ways I regard as part of the family, just as I see, my parents, but also these pieces, they're my brothers and sisters, if you like.
I'd like to think that he would be very pleased that North Wales, or Wales as a whole, continues to be such a buzzing hive of compositional activity in a really, really wide range of genres.
Only yesterday I was having lunch with a very distinguished church musician who said, "Do you ever do the Jesus College service by William Mathias?" So I said, "No, I haven't done it recently." He said, "The best." He said, "You must do it."
His music will live on. I think it will always be performed, and it is music of the highest calibre, really, and of great artistry to come out of Wales in the 20th century. He's a very important figure, and I don't think nobody's going to take that away from him.
He left a great legacy to the church. Cathedrals and parish church choirs still regularly perform William Mathias's music.
He brought a kind of professionalism to music in Wales.
And I think he's one of the few composers Wales has had whose character and spirit will live on. And that's something which we must treasure and guard, because it enriches so much of what we think and do.
Will is unquestionably one of the leading, if not the leading, Welsh composers of all time, really. And I will never forget a performance I gave of St Tyler the year after Will very sadly died. And I remember we finished the piece, great applause in PJ Hall, and I got the students to bring bouquets for all the artists. So I got the biggest bouquet and took it out to Yvonne Mathias, who was in the audience.
I don't think there's enough emphasis now on the striving towards something great that he always strove for. Whether he achieved it or not, it wouldn't have mattered. It was the striving.
In a sense, nobody has been able to fill the void.
Will, I think, has added this much more international look to things, and a more forward look, because Will's music, as in St Tyler, as in Cilwch ac Olwen, as in the Welsh folk song settings, as in Gweddi'r Arglwydd. It's music of our time, but it's music that speaks to people. Welsh people have embraced his music, and it's pushed us forward, I think, as a nation.
That's the philosophy he had. Music is important, and the essence of what music is wide and all-encompassing, but it has to be absolutely important. And I think that's what he gave to the people who he worked with, the people who knew him, and anybody listening to his music will get a sense of that. His heart was a very Welsh one, but it still heard the resonance of a wider world in it. And I think that's given something to the world, but it also tells us about us in Wales as well.